everyone, welcome to the TLDR video for Week 1, Introduction to Linux. Week 1 is Linux Basics. The things that you are going to want to know by the end of the week is a little bit of history of Linux and some characteristics of open source software, paying attention to the differences between Linux and Windows. You can see the PowerPoints on the screen. If we are talking about in the beginning, where Linux was actually coming from, it was actually coming from Multics, which was a failed project. Linux was originally developed by Linus Torvalds. He is the principal developer, but a lot of other people do work on it. And because Linux is open source, it's something that anybody can volunteer to work on whenever they like. Common usage of Linux is actually surprising. A lot of people don't realize how much Linux is actually in the world. If you think about personal computers, you don't see Linux very often. But if you start branching out into things, for example, like phones, Linux is very common. Android is actually a Linux variant. The other place Linux is surprisingly common is servers and the internet. Quite a few very large companies actually run Linux, including places like Amazon and Google. That's actually the main way that they host their servers. Linux is generally used through the command line versus the GUI. A lot of server work is done through the command line because that's a much easier way to manage a server. A GUI, or graphical user interface, is the pictures that you are used to interacting with, and that's not as popular because it will end up giving some other issues. The GUI interface is usually more popular for things like phones and tablets. Linux has advantages and disadvantages like everything else. Some of the advantages include the fact that it, by default, has more security, and because less people use it, there's less malware developed for it. It is also easier to do maintenance and multi-user because it was actually created to be done in a multi-user mode. The biggest cons that you'll find to Linux is the software availability and the difficulty. There are some flavors of Linux that are much easier to use, but a lot of flavors of Linux, because it's not as common for personal computers, tends to be a little bit tougher to use, and you will have a lot of troubleshooting that you'll have to do on your own. Open source software, when we talk about open source versus closed source or proprietary, what we are talking about is the ability to see the code that actually creates the application or operating system. So open source means that we are sharing our source code, we are making it available to other people. Proprietary means that it is owned by a single person. Windows would be an example of proprietary software. Windows is owned by the Microsoft Corporation. They pay developers to work on it. Open source is something that anybody can choose to work on if they would like to. They can fork a project and create their own, and the idea is that information wants to be free. There is no lab this week. If you would like to do a little bit of more research on the history of Linux and what Linux is used for and more reading that way, you are more than welcome to. But the first exercises that I will suggest are going to be next week. Please let me know if you have any questions.